I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today we have a very special guest.
I like how you enunciated guest correctly, Lee.
Because I'm not drunk.
You're not at all.
Not at all.
Mason, do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Yeah. So my name is Mason Vanderford, and I am a sinologist, and I studied my undergraduate in Chinese language at the University of Oregon. Go Ducks!
Woohoo!
Woo! And then after that, I lived in Taiwan for about 4 or 5 years, where I taught English.
That also gets a whoo.
Yeah, we're woos all day, baby. And so after being a glorified babysitter for about 4 or 5 years, I decided to pursue my true passion, which was Chinese literature. So I then decided to study in Würzburg, Germany at the University of Würzburg, and I studied Chinese, or technically it was Chinese studies with the focus on late Ming, history and innovation. It was like late Ming imperial China literature. And then there I've had my focus on mercantile handbooks.
Right. And you wrote your MA thesis on mercantile handbooks, right?
Yeah, so I focused on one specific handbook and how it was a depiction of life for merchants and regular lifestyle for late Ming China. And the big thing was that it was really interesting to see how much that stuff is still used today. So a lot of the tips and stuff, and it was good to just see a new version of something I've never seen before.
Yeah. So for the listener who's not intimately familiar with the late Ming period,
who is not as brilliant as Lee and I are in all things to do with China, in other words.
I would be more humble in that. Mason, you're kind of I don't want to sound too hyperbolic, but you're sort of a world expert on these merchant books, right? Like there are only a couple
of get carried away.
You're an expert. You're going to boost our podcast numbers if we can position you as a world-class expert. So just go with it, please.
No, but can you explain? Because before I looked over your writing, I knew a little bit about Ming merchant books. But can you just tell us what we're looking? Well, like what is it actually we would be reading if we were reading a Ming merchant book?
So this was actually how I got introduced to these, because I got introduced to these handbooks through my advisor. And so what you were reading is these books were pretty much like somebody was telling you, like sitting down, having a beer with you and telling you what to do and what not to do. And so if you're traveling, be careful on this route because it's notorious for bandits. Or when you're dealing with family members, this is one of my favorite ones. It was when you're dealing with family members, keep a very, very exact record of everything that goes on between you and your family members.
Right.
So it was these things where they originated actually as route books, where the merchants would pass them along to each other and they would get them, but then they started adding commentaries. And so, Cheng Yu, the guy that wrote the book that I did my main focus on, the Shishang Leiyao, his big thing was he took all those commentary from the route books and put them into a big, kind of compiled them all into a lei shu.
So is that Huang Bian?
Yes, Huang Bian he did the original handbooks, and then I'm sorry, I haven't refreshed for in a long time. There was Huang Bian who made the original, and then there was another guy who brought together the book that I focused on.
Right. So Huang Bian, we're talking about 1550s, 1580s, the latter half of the 16th century. Is that correct?
Yes, right about in that time.
Now, this is interesting, and for the listener, and I'm sure all of you have by now read many such merchant books. It's a fairly common element in the publishing market. But it's funny in a way. It's a little bit like a travel guide, but we take travel guides for granted. We're like, well, of course you can buy something about going to France and seeing stuff, but several centuries ago, having a guide to tell you what to avoid and what to do was gold. It was huge. And has long roots in Chinese history, not so much the specific roots, but each place has its own unique thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually part of the way that he made this book. The guy's name was Cheng Chunyu, was the writer of the book that I focused on. And his big thing was he focused on different areas. So if you're going up in Dongbei in the northeastern part, be careful for this, and that. If you're going down in Sujiang in that area, this, that, and that, be careful. So it was interesting to see how he differentiated them, especially at that time around in 15th, 16th century.
Right. And, in your thesis, and actually I should point out to the listener, in case you hear us stumbling over the occasional name, it's quite easy to forget a lot of things in an MA thesis. If Lee quizzed me now about my MA thesis, I'd be like, it was
MA theses are best forgotten.
I agree. Anyway, no, but Masons is really interesting because Lee and I very rarely get to read stuff where we're like, huh, I actually didn't know any of that because we're, as I mentioned before, so brilliant. But the reason it's interesting is because so much of Chinese literature relies on a sense of place. And this is especially true in the 20th century. A lot of writers like Shen Congwen, I think in particular, makes their career off of stories that bring to life a certain rural or a sense of place, right? These people do these things, these traditions, etc., right? And these guidebooks, these merchant books, are the codification of that. If you go here, this is what you're going to see. These are the people you're going to meet. Now, Mason, tell us a little bit about the development, because you don't just start out the very first edition as someone going, let me give you the full breakdown of the whole empire from ground up. So what do we start with, and how do we get to the book you wrote most of your stuff on?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, you guys. I am on my computer right now looking at my master's thesis because, like you said,
and Lee is currently looking at Wikipedia to get his dates. So we're even.
It's all good. So there was actually the big thing with the emergence of route books was in late period China. The biggest thing for this, the rise of why the route books became so popular, was for the four occupational stratification, which was the merchants, the scholars, the farmers, and there's one other one, but then so the predecessors,
the gentry,
or the gentry. And
is it military?
No, it's gentry.
No, gentry was like the scholars and like the officials.
Yeah,
and so before that they had a lot of different. The biggest one was the comprehensive illustrated route book, the Yuteng Lucheng Tuji, I think it was. And so this was the original route book that wasn't even government issued. So this was just people would make these books from their experiences and just kind of go off of that.
And so they were circulating kind of privately, right?
Exactly. So you would go into an inn and they would actually leave these books at inns where.
So when you say inn, you're talking essentially about not just like a place where you sleep, but also where you get your meal, where you trade information, all of that stuff. I mean, it's so much more than what you think of today as a modern inn. It's almost like the kind of 17th century London coffee house, right?
London coffee house, or you could say bar.
Yeah.
Like it's where you just kind of chit chat. Yeah. And so they would go to these places, and they would have gazetteers and just stuff like this with little bits of information, and they would start recording these and keep these at these inns. And the inns would actually sell these to traveling merchants, so where they could take all these different gazetteers and all this stuff, and then they would kind of started keeping them. And that's when the route book started to come around, when they would have all this information, and people would start writing it down.
Can I ask you, Mason, are these, well, what's the difference between a gazetteer and a route book? Because, I mean, in Chinese literature, you have this long tradition of the gazetteer, which is essentially a government official in China goes from the capital to some bufu, and I'm using the politically correct.
Thank you. That way we don't have to put a little E next to our podcast.
Right. So some bufu location in the empire, in Tiansha, and goes and kind of describes the crazy things that the locals do, the like weird loincloths that they wear, and like things like that. How is the route book different from a gazetteer?
So the route book was actually different because it kind of was like an encyclopedia of gazetteers, if you want to like put it in layman's term. That's really what it was. And then these route books were mainly focused around certain regions at first. So Huang Bian, that person you brought up, he focused all on Huizhou, where that was the Huizhou merchants were the merchants of the day. And these gazetteers would be literally for any Bufu, I love your term, Bufu village in the middle of nowhere. So they would take these and put them into some, and start even the route books would even start sorting them by different area and locales.
Yeah. So this, we have the route book, but the book that you wrote most of your master's thesis on was a little bit more than a route book. Tell us what differs from a route book to what you were writing about.
So a route book tells you exactly how to get from A to B. And what this book that I focused on was actually how to get to A to B safely. That's actually direct quote from my professor. Was how to say this. And then that was the original, super original version of it when he kind of took the route book and then he put it in a more let's get you from A to B safely, and let's make sure you make your money, and then let's make sure you keep records of your money, and then let's make sure you don't do this, you do this, or when you're, and it just almost became like a guide to how to be a merchant in this time.
So yeah, and because there's obviously a lot more to being a merchant than just going from point A to point B. It's who do you interact with and how. And this is the interesting intersection. And this may be a little hinge point for us to get into more of what you're doing now, podcasting wise, in terms of literature. In order to write something like what's the full name of the book you focused on?
Shishang Leiyao, the best translated version, and the version I gave it was the Encyclopedia for Gentry and Merchants.
A real clickbait title, right? Anyone's going to go look for this sucker. But the reason there's an intersection here is because there's a workup from people just recording things like, hey, there's a pothole, don't step in that, all the way up to, look, if you're going to be traveling through Suzhou, make sure you do the following things, which brings it to the level of observing people and how they interact. And this is important because it's such an important strain in Chinese literature, the regional color, the tusi, the sort of the specialty of that region, right? Even like the first time I was in China, when I was in Shandong province, there's just things Shandong is known for. I mean,
dumplings,
raw garlic with your dumplings, which is delicious as long as you don't mind tasting it for 3 days afterwards. People who can drink a lot. When I got to start my master's degree at Nankai, we went out with one of my professors. And before we went out, this Canadian buddy of mine, we're the only Waigoren, the only Westerners in the program. We were going out with this professor, and somebody said, "Oh, who are you going out to dinner with?" And we said, "Oh, we're going with, Li Laoshi, Professor Li." They're like, "Oh, be careful. He comes from Shandong." Now, if you had never lived in China, you'd be like, "Why does that matter?" We'd been in China long enough for like, right, but we know what we're doing. Just it's okay. It's, whatever. But this sense of place is so entrenched in Chinese culture. Mason, Lee and I have talked a little about, for example, Laoshi's tea house, and there's works throughout Chinese literature that are very rooted in that place. Now, the work you wrote about is kind of the compendium of all places, and you've obviously studied it in depth. When you read it, did you get the sense that the author really had a lot of detail about each given place, or was it kind of repetitive and sort of the same kind of things?
Well, so that's actually really true about some of the things that he talks about are very broad. Like when you go but then some of the things are it's almost like he was nitpicking. And I might even say this, he was almost racist towards certain parts. So like,
that's not surprising at all.
Yeah, yeah.
I assume Henan Ren are thieves, right?
Absolutely.
Funny you say that. Yeah. He actually brought up the Henan area, I forget the old term for it. He brought up that area and how they have the wildest bandits you've ever seen, only comparable to Mongolia.
Wow.
And so
and so we should point out to the listener who maybe hasn't been exposed to inter-Chinese racism.
Intra-Chinese
racism. Henan Ren are very much stigmatized in China as thieves. Like,
right. There's that old joke, and I'm going to get this wrong, I think, but there's a flood and there's a bunch of Henan Ren on a boat and it's sinking, and somebody offers to come up and save them, and they start haggling over the price. Something like that. I think that was Henan Ren. Anyway, Go ahead, Mason. Sorry, we could totally cut you off there.
Oh, no. And that's totally true because you can definitely, it's like, he's not just coming out and saying like, this place is gnarly, be careful here. He's literally saying this area has a lot of adulterers. Like, so his view on Shanghai and Suzhou,
hang on, was the adulterers thing a selling point or a warning?
again, funny you say that, it's both actually. So
wow.
like he talks about Suzhou and in the Shanghai area, kind of, and he talks about how you need to be careful of women of the night because they'll be the best women of the night, but they'll also take, I'm going to paraphrase this, they'll take your kidneys.
Wow.
So
take your kidneys. I love
That was completely paraphrased.
So Mason, can I ask, I mean, all three of us have been in Professor Maram Epstein's class.
That's right. I forgot that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we are all students of Maram Epstein. And so I have to ask the question about gender. Like, what role does gender play? You're talking about sex workers, I guess is the politically correct term we should be using right now.
There we go.
Who knows what it will be tomorrow. But, sex workers are a part of this work. And I mean, anytime that men are traveling alone, especially merchant men with a fair amount of money, you're going to have sex workers, male or female. What role do sex workers play and what role does gender play in these kind of merchant route books?
Yeah. So it is huge, actually. Like a lot of the stuff to watch out for is to watch if a woman comes up to you in a crowd. There was one, if a woman comes up to you in a crowd, make sure that someone's not watching her for more than a short while. Because if someone watching her is more, that's like, I'm sorry, this might take you over the explicit mark, but there's a pimp watching a prostitute, a sexual worker. And so it's interesting to see how he put this kind of women, because these women as prostitutes. And the other thing was they talked about a lot about porters, the people who would travel by sea and you would hire them, and how they're always men. If you see a woman porter, do not trust her. She's going to steal from you as a I don't want to say a direct quote, but a paraphrased quote from one of his things. Yeah.
Well, let's, because we don't have an hour and a half, although it would be fun if we did. Let's shift gears a little bit here because, you mentioned at the outset, you mentioned to pursue your first, actually, before we get there, I want to ask one other sort of this linking question. You went to study at the University of Würzburg, and I don't speak German. That's the best German I've got. I speak French, but Achtung, whatever. I only know that word from a U2 album. Why Germany? Why the University of Würzburg versus any of the other universities in the world? What took you to Germany for this stuff?
Do you want what I told my mom, or do you want my honest opinion?
I want to hear both. I want to see how they compare.
Okay, so I'll tell you my mom's what I told my mother. It's actually one of the top sinologist departments in all sinology in all of Europe. And they have a great a good history, and it was a really good place. And then why I really went there, it was free.
I'm with you. That's why. Why'd you go to the
accepted me,
University of
in
Oregon? I'm like, well, because everyone else turned me down. That too, but mainly because no one else took me anyway. All right. So let's shift gears here because you do have a podcast. Lee and I have both listened to it. Plum Forest. We'll do a plug towards the end as well, so everybody remembers what it was.
Nice.
And we owe Mason something an apology because for years we've marketed ourselves as like we're the Chinese literature podcast. There is no other. We're the alpha and the omega, the sine qua non. Well, we're not actually.
Yeah.
But before we get into exactly what you do on the podcast, Mason, what made you mentioned your first love being Chinese literature. What made you shift gears like this? Because there is quite a jump from merchant route books to what your podcast is. So what took you there?
Actually not as big as a jump as you'd think, because like at these inns and stuff, they would have these short stories. And so this was actually what I originally wanted to write my master's thesis on, was some of these short stories and their depiction, but that's a whole can of worms,
right?
A whole nother can of worms. But so I got really interested in these stories, and every time I would read I would read the Chinese, and then I would read the English translation, and it was just like god awful. You've done this. You've seen some of those translations where the opinions change, and the translations, it feels like you're reading just something that was just regurgitated through a sewer. God awful. So when I was actually in Germany, we were reading some of these short stories like Liao Zai Zhi and Shou Seng Gui and this kind of stuff, Shou Seng Ji, sorry. And I started putting these stories into a modernized version for some of my German classmates. So we'd sit down and we'd do what Germans do best and have a beer. And even my professor joined us one day, and I'd sit there and I retold the story in modernized English. And my professor, if Mara Mepson listens to this, she'll know exactly who I'm talking about. But I'm not going to drop his name because I don't want to throw him under a bus. But he was amazed at how well I was able to convey the crudeness and nastiness and craziness in these short stories in modern English.
Yeah.
And so they were all just like, you could do this really well. Like, why don't you do this for fun? And so I started writing them. And then I started telling them on a podcast in modern English.
Which, for the listener, this is what Mason's current project, the Plum Forest podcast, does. It takes stories, classic stories, weird ones, and retells them. I was just listening to one today that takes place in Nebraska, which is a little bit of cognitive dissonance if you've ever been to Nebraska. And I have. My dad retired from the military in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, so I spent a lot of time in the Great Plains, and so seeing that territory in light of a Chinese vernacular story, I was like, this is weird. But that's exactly the point. Lee and I, and one of the things that Mason, you and I and Lee have all communicated on is Pu Songling. Goodness gracious, if you've read Chinese literature and you've read Pu Songling, you're a fan. I don't see how you could not be a fan, right?
And Mason, would it be wrong to say that what you're doing is becoming a modern day American Pu Songling? Like you're adapting this genre to podcast form, which I would say is a modern form of storytelling, just like Pu Songling was adapting these tales that he heard in tea houses, in inns, in Shandong where he was at. And he adapted them. I mean, we know some of the tales that he actually adapted, and he was playing off of Tang Dynasty Chuanxi, and he was taking them and making them into this Qing Dynasty thing. Are you the next Pu Songling?
He is.
I am now. I've never thought about that, but like as you said, it was like, oh man, he's right.
I am.
That'll be cool. I'm gonna now put that on my resume. So,
I am the American Pu Songling. No, but at Lee's point is a good one. I don't say that very often, but it's true that we started talking about inns. This is a lot of what Pu Songling is drawing on. The quasi legendary origins of the Liao Zai Zhi are that he was basically this dude who just listened to stories and wrote them down. Right.
Yeah.
Now, in Chinese literature and in Chinese historiography, the idea of fidelity to an original source text is not a thing, right? No one really cares if the story you're telling is exactly like the story that came before.
Actually, even now, copyright is still kind of a joke.
Even now, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's almost like it would be weird to try and respect the sort of originality of a story. Like the whole point is that you're reinterpreting and kind of stealing most of it and then tweaking a little bit to make it modern. I mean, to paraphrase Steve Jobs paraphrasing Picasso, right? Like good artist copy, great artist steal.
Right.
Yeah. And it's kind of become that where because like you said, it's like the one I originally told or you were listening to, which is The Egg, by the way, a really funny story.
Yes.
But that one is based off of a story where it actually supposedly took place in Shandong.
Nice.
And so that one, but I took that and I thought I kind of like to mix it, but with like Nebraska, kind of boring.
Right. Well, Shandong doesn't rank very high on people's lists in China of places you need to visit before you die. So it's a fairly bumpkin region in areas. So
exactly
it works.
And so then I'm able to take these stories, put a modern twist on them, so people can enjoy listening to them. Because, like I said before, if you guys tried, because I had a friend of mine, why don't you just tell the original translations? I was like, you want me to read these to you? And my buddy, like, I read like 2 sentences. He goes, all right, just stop.
Never mind.
Yeah.
Well, and the valuable thing about that is, like you mentioned, there's content in the original that if you've read the original Chinese, you sort of get the sense of what's really gross, raunchy, weird, hilarious about it. Someone reading it in translation, most of that is just gone because it's rendered in such a, I would almost say sterile fashion. It's like
Yeah.
reading Shakespeare and not grasping that an entire dialogue is the raunchiest thing you've ever heard because the raunch is very dated. But if you update it, people are like, "Oh, that's disgusting." You're like, "I know it was disgusting then too. That's why it made so much, sense." And
That's why people listened at that point. Yeah.
yeah, do you have? And you've got a bunch of stuff on there. Do you have any favorites, any highlights, any
Ooh.
stories you've done so far where you're like, that was great. That was a lot of fun.
So I did The Men in the Eyes, which was a
Mhm.
Liao Taizi story, and I loved writing. That was actually like the second story I ever wrote.
Mm.
And so like the quality isn't as good as it should be, but I loved writing that one. And that was so much fun. And then there was that egg one was actually one of my favorite ones to write, the one that you
Mm.
listened to in Nebraska, because the dude that did the voice was this British fellow and he was so funny. Like I could make an entire bloopers reel
Yeah,
of him just messing up the word conglomerate.
yeah, it's great.
And that was a really fun one to work with.
And did you ever carry through? I listened to that one. Did you ever carry through on your threat to make the blooper reel available for subscribers?
Ooh, how much money y'all got? Y'all want to join the Plum Forest Patreon?
Yeah, that we might. I don't know. We're broke college students doing
Yeah,
grad
I
students.
feel
Actually,
ya.
Lee, you're less broke than me. Maybe you could get a
Mhm.
subscription and we can both participate. We'll share it.
I'm broke. My wife isn't.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. You've got a sugar mama. You're lucky.
We can talk after class.
Yeah, we'll talk.
We'll talk. Yeah. But no, I am actually planning on putting out a blooper reel because there's a couple other ones like there's the one with the fan boat ride.
Mhm.
That one's got a whole bunch of bloopers with a lot of really funny people where this guy from Florida just like kind of goes off. For like
We got to
5
make sure
minutes.
we got a friend
Yeah.
who grew up in the Louisiana Bayou in Boudreaux, Louisiana. Like I think didn't he take someone in his class took a fan boat to prom? Like that's not an exageration.
You
right?
mean
Did he do that?
He grew up in Homa.
Homa? I was thinking Boudreaux. I don't know why.
No.
I think every town in Louisiana is called Boudreaux. Anyway, because they kind of are. But we got to make sure he gets that one. So, Mason, do you when you write these, do you try to triangulate kind of what part in America corresponds to this part in China, or do you look for just what would be the funniest possible setting for the story?
How do you compare different bufus in different cultural
Good question.
context?
Better question.
So a lot of it actually goes just how I'm feeling that day when I'm writing. It's like there was one where there was on a ridge, so I had to go for a mountainous place.
Mm.
There was one where they were in a bit bustling city, so it was Philadelphia because I don't know, my cousin wanted to do a voice and he wanted to try a Philly voice. So I
Right.
just tweaked it a little bit. So it's always kind of like that. But then if it's like a bigger city, like there's one where they're in San Francisco, and I really wanted that because that was also talking. It was actually based in Suzhou when that was written, and so it was like a busy commercial city area. So it could have been done in New York or in San Francisco, but I just West Coast is the best coast. So yeah.
So sometimes it's a little arbitrary. Sometimes it's kind of forced upon you. Do you
Exactly.
have any intentions of branching out into much longer fiction?
Oh.
Like any chance you might want to try to remake like Jean Ping Mei or something
Oh
like
man.
that?
So I actually talked to this with you guys. Oh, and when I first emailed you,
Yeah.
I want to do a chapter from Shioji, Journey to the West.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like started writing it, and I'm already at like 2.5 hours for one
Holy
chapter.
Oh man.
Because so it's like I'll take like maybe like a 3 or 4 page story, and it'll be about 30 minutes.
Mm.
And that's when I'm kind of cutting or adding. But then like, because I looked at the Shioji and like I was in the Chinese one, and I just got a huge headache after about 2 hours of writing.
It's brutal. Yeah.
It's trying to translate like the pun, like you brought up earlier, the puns are the hardest part about translating, and it's fun to do that with humor because you can bring that like cheesy pickup lines and stuff are so fun to translate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the COG in particular is so loaded with just in jokes and vernacular that I mean it's been translated, but I really think the only way to do it is kind of the way you're doing it. Like just bring it completely out of its context and make something different with it because Lord, some of those old stories you just can't humor, how do you translate humor? It's just
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. Humor does
Reminds
not
me of,
translate.
Being a French expert and genius as I am, the Asterix comics in English are actually incredibly well done because the authors don't try to preserve the sort of French original. They just come up with all their own puns and jokes and names that correspond to the original. And it works much better because you're not trying to figure the source material out. You're just like, oh, that's really funny, right?
Yeah.
So we need to kind of start, I guess, wrapping this up a little bit. We talked about the COG. Do you have any sort of upcoming things you want to let people know about? Like you got stuff coming up that people need to pay attention to?
Season 2, we actually finished season 1 because I got super busy with some school stuff because like I said, I'm a broke college student. But in December, season 2 will come out, and we have so many stories already written and even recorded, and like I'm started editing them.
So get ready for season 2. Some tease. Who are you doing?
We actually did a few the Outside Z.
Awesome.
We did the was it the loyal dog? I think it was
the loyal dog. That's
loyal. That one's good. Yeah. And then I think it's translated as viciously virtuosity. I don't know. It's like this woman who talks to ghosts, and it was so much fun to write because I had a beer or two and I started writing it, and so I could just go off on these women just arguing about how to treat people for medical reasons in Idaho. I don't know why. Again, I don't know why I picked Idaho, but it worked out.
Why not? Why not Idaho? That's really the question.
So
but that one, that should tell you right there.
Yeah, and then actually the other thing is a good friend of mine actually gave me this like random Chinese, and I haven't been able to find it when I lived in Taiwan, and she gave me a old short story book just for poops and giggles, and for some reason I kept it with me for some of this time, and I've been actually using quite a bit of those. So there's a couple off the top of my head I have no idea, but because there's like 30 of them now written. So
you just have to listen is the moral of that story.
And they are wild as you'll ever expect.
Well, and this is the fun thing about this project is that people who are not familiar with Chinese literature or who have only come at the Chinese tradition through Confucius and Lao Tzu and Du Fu
and the boring
but even the more boring stuff. But you come away from this idea that Chinese is a very decorous, well-behaved culture. Like they're polite and they observe nature, and you're like, wow, negative. Like there is some bananas stuff in this tradition, and it's important to bring that out so that people don't come away with this weird Orientalist notion that Chinese literature is above earthly concerns and everything like that.
And you definitely do have that tradition, but it's good to get into the like raunchy stuff, like that dorm room podcast that you did. That was it was just kind of like I don't want to say pornographic because it wasn't something that was disturbing at all or anything like that, but it was just like sex, right?
Yeah.
Like people talking about sex and like normal stuff,
which is what happens in these stories. Yeah,
exactly. Dorm rooms are, but it's also fun because it's like I get to add kind of like a joke because I'm not gonna put sexual stuff like in it, so I'll put like funk music or something, or there's something that I use where it's like don't. Like this isn't a 50 Shades podcast, but you can guess where this went.
Right.
Like, yeah.
So any final thoughts, Lee and Mason, final words for the people?
It's been good to do this with you guys, straight up. And I'm glad and check, I will, you might edit this out, but I will check out your guys or post your podcast as much as I can. And you guys do great stuff. Like you guys talked about, there was one that the first one I listened to and I was like, it took on, oh, I'm sorry, my brain farting. But it took on this thing, and I'd never heard of a view on that like that, and it sounded exactly like Professor Epstein.
But it might have been Professor Epstein.
We sometimes just like completely like take our notes from her class and just read them verbatim.
Which say what you will, she knows her stuff real well.
Lee and I each have a sort of short list of favorite seminars we've had in grad school, and both of us have one of Marham's in the top 3. So
definitely.
Anyway, but to give a final plug, Mason's podcast is the Plum Forest Podcast. Definitely listen to it. It's the I said earlier, we're not the only Chinese literature podcast. And one of the fun things is that Mason's doing
A totally different
totally
kind of
different thing.
thing. Like
it's in its own realm.
like
so,
I said,
yeah.
it's really, he's more of like the modern day Pusong Ling. And
yeah.
I think you should put that on
Yeah.
your stickers, which are available. Modern day Pusong Ling. I don't know. I mean, I think our listeners will get that, but I'm not sure if you like started, putting stickers up
Yeah,
everywhere.
I think maybe your head on Pusong Ling's body would be excellent.
And I know what I'm going to do tonight, Ben.
Excellent.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, Mason, thanks so much for stopping by. This is a blast.
This was, and again, check out, head to our website, plumforestpodcast.com, and you can listen. You can even get your free stickers there. And Pusong Ling headed, or Mason on a Pusong Ling body
Yes.
is coming. Get ready
Nice.
for that.
I'm Lee Moore,
Thank you.
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Thank you for joining us today, Mason.